Have you ever been fired over a Zoom call? No warning, no apology. Just a CEO with a smug smile cutting your entire career with one click. But what if I told you I turned that call into leverage to hijack a $94 million investment deal overnight? Brent thought he'd won, but he never actually read the fine print in the clauses I wrote myself. This is how I brought down an entire company with nothing but patience and a single email. My name is Rachel Morgan, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the lead integration logic engineer at Hypernova Systems, 34 years old, 10 years with the company, architect of every critical system that made our platform worth anything. I'd built my entire career there, pouring myself into code that ran like clockwork, into documentation so clean that junior devs could understand it, into solutions that saved the company millions. I was working from my home office that Tuesday morning, deep in a particularly complex refactoring project, when the email landed in my inbox at 10:45 a.m. Urgent all-hands meeting, mandatory attendance. The sender was Elliot Kane, our new CEO who'd been brought in 6 months ago to revolutionize our trajectory, as the board put it. I should have seen it coming when he started using phrases like synergistic optimization and human capital reallocation. I clicked the Zoom link expecting another one of his theatrical presentations about market penetration or vertical integration. Instead, I found myself staring at Elliot's perfectly lit face, his custom background showing some generic Silicon Valley vista, that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. There were 43 participants in the call. I recognized most of the engineering team, some folks from product, a handful from operations. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice," Elliot began, his voice carrying that false warmth executives master in their MBA programs. "As you know, Hypernova is entering an exciting new phase of growth. We've attracted significant investor interest, and to capitalize on this momentum, we need to make some strategic adjustments to our organizational structure." Strategic adjustments, the corporate euphemism that makes my skin crawl even now. He pulled up a slide deck, all minimalist design and meaningless metrics. Effective immediately, we're implementing a comprehensive restructuring of our technical divisions. This realignment will position us for exponential growth and allow us to achieve the scalability our investors expect. Then came the gut punch. A list of names appeared on screen. 40% of the engineering team. My name was third from the top. Those listed will be transitioning out of Hypernova with a standard severance package. HR will contact you within the hour with details. We thank you for your contributions and wish you the best in your future endeavors. But here's what made my blood turn to ice. As Elliot continued his corporate poetry about lean operations and optimized headcount, he switched to another slide, my system architecture diagram, the integration logic I'd spent 3 years perfecting, the proprietary algorithms that made our data processing 70% faster than any competitor. "As you can see," he said, gesturing at my work like he'd created it himself, "our revolutionary approach to integrated data processing is what sets Hypernova apart. This is exactly what Argent Capital finds so compelling about our platform." That's when I noticed the additional participants in the Zoom. 3 names I didn't recognize, their cameras off. I did a quick LinkedIn search while Elliot droned on. All 3 were senior partners at Argent Capital, the venture fund everyone in tech had been talking about. They were listening in, hidden, while Elliot presented my work as the crown jewel of his leadership. He was using my own creation as the centerpiece of his investor pitch while simultaneously throwing me out like yesterday's garbage. The audacity of it made my hands shake, but I kept my camera on, my expression neutral, professional to the end. I even typed "thank you for the opportunity" in the chat before leaving the call. But as I sat there in my home office, staring at the blank screen where my career had just ended, something shifted inside me. Not rage, exactly. Something colder, more calculated. Elliot thought he was clever. Thought he could take what I'd built and discard me like a deprecated function. He thought those investor shadows in his Zoom call would never know whose mind had actually created what they were buying into. He was wrong. What Elliot didn't know, what nobody except me knew, was that I'd written more than just code. I'd written the rules, and buried deep in those rules was a single clause that was about to become his worst nightmare. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even close my laptop in anger. Instead, I opened a document I hadn't looked at in 2 years, the Hypernova Intellectual Property Compliance Framework. 73 pages of mind-numbing legal text that I'd personally drafted when the company first started scaling. Back then, the previous CEO had asked me to help establish protocols for protecting our proprietary technology. I'd been thorough, perhaps more thorough than anyone realized. Page 47, Section 7, Subsection 3B. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Any production deployment utilizing optimization algorithms classified as original author proprietary requires explicit written consent from the designated original author, regardless of employment status. This consent must be documented and filed with both legal and compliance departments prior to any live environment implementation. Violation of this protocol constitutes unauthorized use of protected intellectual property. I'd written that clause after watching a competitor poach one of our engineers and immediately deploy his work. The legal team had approved it without much thought. It seemed like standard IP protection. The beauty was in the classification system I'd created. Every piece of critical integration logic I developed was tagged with my digital signature in the repository, marked as original author proprietary. It was all there in the Git history, immutable and time-stamped. But knowing the rule existed and executing on it were 2 different things. I needed to be surgical about this. No emotional moves, no obvious retaliation. Everything had to be clean, legal, and unassailable. First, I accessed the company repository while my credentials were still active. HR had said they'd contact me within an hour, which meant I probably had at least 2 hours before IT received the termination ticket. I didn't download anything. That would be theft. Instead, I simply generated a comprehensive audit report of all systems bearing my authorship signature, 312 files, the entire backbone of Hypernova's data processing infrastructure. Next, I updated the metadata on each file, using my still valid access to add a simple notation, IP status, pending review per Compliance Framework Section 7.3b. This wasn't sabotage. This was following protocol. The system would flag these files automatically during the next compliance scan, which ran every Friday at 6 p.m. Then came the masterstroke. I logged into our internal documentation system and created a formal IP disclosure notice, following the exact template the legal department had created. In it, I documented every algorithm, every optimization technique, every piece of integration logic I developed. I marked each item as personal intellectual property, provisional company license pending written agreement. I time-stamped it at 11:58 a.m., exactly 2 minutes before my access would likely be revoked. The notice was automatically distributed to the legal team, the compliance officer, and, because I'd carefully selected the critical IP disclosure category, to every member of the board of directors. It would sit in their inboxes like a ticking time bomb, looking perfectly routine until someone tried to deploy my code without my signature. At 12:15 p.m., my email access was cut. At 12:30 p.m., my Slack went dark. By 1 p.m., I received a call from HR explaining my severance terms, 2 weeks of pay, COBRA insurance continuation, and a standard non-disparagement agreement. I listened politely, asked no questions, and accepted everything. What HR didn't mention, what they didn't know to mention, was that the non-disparagement agreement said nothing about intellectual property rights. It was a standard template, focused on preventing me from bad-mouthing the company on social media. Nobody had thought to include a clause forcing me to authorize the use of my proprietary algorithms. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning my home office, filing for unemployment, and updating my LinkedIn profile. To anyone watching, I was just another casualty of corporate restructuring, handling my termination with professional grace. I even endorsed Elliot for leadership and strategic planning on LinkedIn, knowing he'd see it and interpret it as submission. But while I was playing the part of the defeated engineer, I knew that somewhere in Hypernova's gleaming offices, a compliance scan was scheduled to run in 4 days. And when it did, every single system that mattered would light up red, tagged with warnings about unauthorized IP usage. Elliot would probably ignore it at first, dismiss it as a technical glitch. That would be his second mistake. His first was thinking he could steal from me and walk away clean. The trap was set, baited with his own arrogance. All I had to do now was wait and let his ambition do the rest. The all-hands meeting happened on a Thursday. 3 days after my termination. I wasn't there, of course, but I had eyes and ears everywhere. Former colleagues who were just as disgusted by Elliot's butchery of our team. They kept me informed through signal messages and encrypted emails, painting a picture of corporate delusion that would have been comedic if it wasn't so pathetic. Elliot stood before the remaining employees in the main conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. Behind him, a massive display showed Hypernova 2.0 scaling to the stars. He wore his signature navy blazer, the one that probably cost more than most engineers' monthly rent, and that same practiced smile that made you want to check your wallet. "Team, I have incredible news," he announced, his voice carrying that synthetic enthusiasm they teach at executive coaching seminars. Argent Capital has expressed serious interest in leading our Series C round. We're talking about a $94 million investment that will transform Hypernova into the market leader we were always meant to be. The room was quiet. Half the engineering team was gone, and those remaining were updating their resumes between sprint meetings. But Elliot interpreted silence as awe. To lead this transformation, I'm pleased to introduce our new head of platform development, Zara Mitchell. Enter Zara, 26 years old, fresh from a 2-year stint at a failed startup where her main achievement was implementing a color-coded Kanban board. She'd been hired not for her technical prowess, she had none, but because she was Elliot's former colleague's daughter. Nepotism wrapped in the language of fresh perspectives and innovative thinking. "Hi, everyone," Zara chirped, her voice like nails on a whiteboard to anyone who actually understood our systems. "I'm super excited to leverage our core competencies and really drill down into our integration architecture. I've reviewed the documentation, and I think with some agile sprints and maybe a few hack days, we can really move the needle on deployment velocity." She'd reviewed the documentation, my documentation, the 1,000+ pages of technical specifications I'd written, complete with dependency graphs, error handling protocols, and optimization notes that had taken years to perfect. She'd skimmed it like it was a Medium article on productivity hacks. "Zara will be overseeing the deployment of our enhanced platform for the Argent Capital demonstration," Elliot continued. "We need to show them a live production environment by next Friday. I have complete confidence in her ability to deliver." My former colleague Brad, one of the few senior engineers left, raised his hand. "What about the compliance warnings on the integration modules? The system's been throwing flags since the Friday scan." Elliot waved dismissively. "Technical bureaucracy. Zara, can you handle that?" "Absolutely," she responded with the confidence of someone who didn't know what they didn't know. "I'll just override the warnings in the deployment config. We can circle back on compliance after we secure the funding." Override the warnings. In any other context, those 3 words would have triggered a 5-alarm fire in the engineering department, but anyone who might have objected was either gone or too defeated to care. Brad just shook his head and went back to his laptop. What followed was a masterclass in incompetence masquerading as leadership. Zara spent the next 3 days reimagining the deployment pipeline, which mostly consisted of her dragging boxes around in a flowchart tool and asking junior developers to make it work like the picture. She couldn't read my actual code. It was too complex, too interconnected. Instead, she tried to reverse engineer the system from the user interface, like trying to understand a symphony by looking at the concert hall seats. By Tuesday night, she'd managed to create what she called a minimum viable deployment. In reality, she'd bypassed 17 critical error checks, removed 3 load balancers, and somehow connected the authentication service directly to the public API endpoint. It was like watching someone try to perform heart surgery with a butter knife and a YouTube tutorial. The staging environment started failing at 8:43 p.m. on Tuesday. Small errors at first, timeout warnings, memory leaks, the occasional null pointer exception. Zara's solution: increase the server capacity. When that didn't work, she tried restarting the services every hour through a cron job. It was like putting duct tape on a severing artery. Elliot remained blissfully ignorant, sending hourly Slack messages about pushing through and startup hustle. He'd already told Argent Capital that the demo would be flawless, that Hypernova's platform was enterprise-ready, scalable to millions of users. He'd promised them a live demonstration of our revolutionary integration logic processing real-time data from 12 different sources simultaneously. What he didn't know, what Zara couldn't possibly understand from her flowcharts and hack days, was that my integration logic wasn't just code. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of dependencies, each function relying on permissions and protocols that I'd embedded throughout the system. Without my authorization signature, it was like trying to conduct an orchestra where half the musicians couldn't read their sheet music. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the countdown to catastrophe had begun. Thursday, 2:14 a.m. My phone buzzed with a cascade of notifications from former colleagues. The Slack channels I could no longer access were apparently exploding like digital fireworks. Brad sent me a single text: "It's happening." The staging environment hadn't just failed, it had catastrophically imploded. Every service that touched my integration logic had entered what engineers call a death spiral. The API gateway was returning 500 errors. The data processing pipeline was stuck in an infinite loop, consuming CPU cycles like a black hole. The authentication service was randomly logging users into other accounts. It was beautiful in its thoroughness, like watching a building demolish itself from the inside out. Zara, according to my sources, was in full panic mode. She'd called an emergency war room at 2:30 a.m., dragging half the DevOps team out of bed. They tried everything: rolling back deployments, clearing caches, even the desperate turn it off and on again approach. Nothing worked. Every time they thought they'd fixed one issue, 3 more would spawn. "Why won't it authenticate properly?" Zara reportedly screamed at 3:45 a.m., her fresh perspective crumbling under the weight of actual complexity. Marcus, a DevOps engineer who'd survived the layoffs, found the first real clue. Buried in the error logs, repeating every few seconds, was a single line: compliance warning. Primary logic owner verification required for production deployment. See Framework Section 7.3b. "What the hell is Section 7.3b? Zara demanded. Marcus pulled up the compliance framework on his screen. As he read the clause out loud, the war room went silent. They all knew what it meant. They all knew who the primary logic owner was, and they all knew she was gone. "Can't we just override it?" Zara asked, her voice smaller now. "That's what you've been trying to do," Marcus replied. "The system is designed to prevent exactly that. It's not a bug, it's a feature." By 6 a.m., word had reached Elliot. He stormed into the office wearing yesterday's clothes, his perfect hair slightly disheveled, that practiced smile replaced with something between rage and fear. The Argent Capital demo was in 28 hours. "Fix it," he commanded. "I don't care what it takes. Hire consultants. Call Microsoft. Call anyone. Just fix it." But here's the thing about complex systems. You can't just fix them when the person who built them has explicitly locked you out. It would be like trying to break into a safe when the locksmith has specifically designed it to destroy its contents if tampered with. The team tried everything. They brought in a consultant from Accenture who charged $3,000 to tell them what they already knew. They tried to rebuild the integration logic from scratch, but that would take months, not hours. They even considered rolling back to an older version, but Elliot had been showing Argent Capital the new features for weeks. Going backward would be admitting failure. By Thursday evening, desperation had set in. The production environment was holding, but barely. It was running on the last stable version that had my authorization signature, but that was from 3 weeks ago. None of the new features Elliot had promised were available. The revolutionary improvements he'd been selling to Argent Capital were trapped behind a wall of my own making. Then Zara made the fatal mistake. In a moment of desperate inspiration at 11:20 p.m., she decided to push the staging code directly to production. If we can't test it, she reasoned, we'll just have to trust it works. Brad tried to stop her. Marcus literally reached for her laptop, but Elliot, standing behind her like a desperate gambler doubling down on a losing hand, said, "Do it. We need to show strength. We need to show we can deliver." She clicked deploy at 11:59 p.m. Within minutes, the production environment started to mirror the staging disaster, but this time, it wasn't just internal systems failing. Real customers were affected. Data integrity warnings flooded in. Payment processing froze. User sessions corrupted. The status page went from green to yellow to red to black, a color I didn't even know was possible. Hypernova's entire platform, the system that Elliot had valued at $94 million, was collapsing in real time, and somewhere in the chaos, that same compliance warning kept appearing, like a signature on a masterpiece of destruction. Primary logic owner verification required. My phone buzzed again. Brad had sent a screenshot of the company's status page. Every single service was down. At the bottom, the automated system had generated an incident report number INC 7312. I smiled. Those were the last 4 digits of my employee ID. Even in chaos, my code remembered who had created it. The Argent Capital demo was in 16 hours, and Elliot was about to learn that you can't steal something that was never truly yours to take. Friday morning, 9 a.m., while Elliot's team was drowning in their self-created disaster, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop. I'd been waiting for this moment, timing it perfectly, not too early to seem eager, not too late to seem negligent, just right to seem professional. I opened Gmail and began composing the most important email of my career. The recipient list was strategic. Hypernova's entire board of directors, Elliot Kane, the legal department, the compliance officer, and, here was the kill shot, 3 senior partners at Argent Capital whose email addresses were helpfully visible in the original Zoom meeting where I'd been terminated. Subject: Urgent Intellectual Property Compliance Notice regarding Hypernova Integration Systems. Dear board members and stakeholders, I am writing to formally notify you of an ongoing unauthorized use of proprietary algorithms and integration logic within Hypernova's production environment. As documented in the IP disclosure notice filed at 11:58 a.m. on Tuesday, March 14th, all optimization algorithms classified as original author proprietary require explicit written consent for production deployment per Section 7.3b of Hypernova's compliance framework. To date, I have not provided such consent, nor have I been approached to negotiate terms for the continued use of my intellectual property. The systems currently failing in your production environment are doing so because they are attempting to execute proprietary logic without proper authorization. This is not a technical malfunction. This is a legal safeguard operating as designed. I am prepared to discuss licensing terms that would allow Hypernova to restore full functionality to its platform. However, I must stress that any continued unauthorized deployment may constitute willful IP infringement with significant legal ramifications. For the integrity of all parties involved, including potential investors, I recommend immediate suspension of any demonstrations or deployments until proper authorization is obtained. I remain available for discussion at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Rachel Morgan, original author and IP holder, Hypernova Integration Architecture. I attach 3 documents, the original compliance framework, with Section 7.3b highlighted, the Git history showing my authorship of every critical component, and the IP disclosure notice timestamp proving I'd followed proper protocol before my access was revoked. Then I hit send. The email landed like a nuclear warhead in the middle of their crisis, according to Brad, who was watching the chaos unfold from inside. Elliot's face went from red to white to a shade of green that suggested immediate nausea. The board members, who'd been calling every 5 minutes for updates, suddenly went silent. At 9:45 a.m., Argent Capital sent their own email, copying everyone, including me. In light of the IP concerns raised, we are postponing today's demonstration pending legal review. We take intellectual property rights seriously and require full compliance before proceeding with any investment. Please provide documentation of proper IP authorization within 24 hours. The legal department went into overdrive. Within an hour, I received a call from Hypernova's chief legal officer, Patricia Stern. She was professional but clearly stressed. "Rachel, I've reviewed your claims. The documentation appears to be in order. What are your terms?" "I want to be very clear, Patricia," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but Elliot used my work to secure investor interest while simultaneously terminating my employment. That's not just wrong, it's theft." "What do you want?" she asked, cutting to the chase. "I want a consulting agreement, $500,000 for a 1-year license to use my existing code. If Hypernova wants permanent rights, we can discuss a buyout at market rate. I've had 3 companies approach me about my integration architecture. The going rate is around $2 million. There was a long pause. "That's substantial." "It's less than 3% of what Elliot claims my code is worth to Argent Capital. I think it's quite reasonable. I'll need to discuss this with the board." "Of course. But Patricia, every hour that passes with the system down is costing Hypernova customers and credibility. I'm ready to sign today if the terms are met." At 11:30 a.m., Elliot himself called me. His voice had lost all its polish. "Rachel, this is extortion." "No, Elliot, extortion is presenting someone else's work to investors while firing them over Zoom. What I'm doing is enforcing my legal rights. Rights that are clearly documented in your own compliance framework. You sabotaged us." "I did nothing of the sort. I followed every protocol. I filed every required notice. Your new head of platform development simply chose to ignore compliance warnings. That's not sabotage. That's incompetence." He tried threats. He tried pleading. He even tried offering me my job back. But I held firm. The demo was in 4 hours, and his $94 million dream was evaporating with each passing minute. At 1:15 p.m., my phone rang again. It was Patricia. "The board has made a decision," she said, "but it's not about your terms." My stomach tightened. Had I overplayed my hand? "Elliot Kane has been relieved of his position as CEO, effective immediately. The board would like to discuss a different arrangement with you." The king had fallen, but the game wasn't over yet. The emergency board meeting was held over Zoom at 2:30 p.m. I was invited to attend, watching as 8 faces appeared on my screen. The entire board of directors, including 2 investors who'd been silent partners until now. Elliot was notably absent, though I could imagine him somewhere, probably with his perfect hair finely disheveled, watching his carefully constructed empire crumble. The board chairman, David Hartley, spoke first. His voice was measured, but I could hear the barely controlled fury underneath. "Ms. Morgan, we've just concluded our investigation into this situation. What Mr. Kane did, terminating you while simultaneously using your work to court investors, represents a severe breach of fiduciary duty and ethical standards." Another board member, someone I recognized as a former Microsoft executive, added, "We've also discovered he made commitments to Argent Capital that were, to put it mildly, extremely optimistic. He promised features that don't exist, scalability we can't deliver, and integration capabilities that were entirely dependent on your proprietary work." Patricia Stern shared her screen, showing a legal assessment. "The liability exposure is significant. If we can't deliver what Elliot promised, we're looking at potential fraud allegations. Argent Capital is already asking hard questions." "Here's what we're proposing," David continued. "We want to bring you back, not as an employee, but as chief technology consultant with a significant equity stake, 2% of the company, plus a $500,000 annual consulting fee. You would have complete autonomy over the technical architecture and veto power over any technology decisions." It was a good offer, a very good offer, but I'd learned something important over the past week. When you hold all the cards, you don't settle for good. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I need you to understand the full situation. During my review of the systems, I've identified that approximately 80% of Hypernova's core platform relies on my integration logic, not just the parts Elliot was showing off, but the fundamental infrastructure. Without my authorization, you're essentially running on borrowed time. The board exchanged worried glances through their individual cameras. "What are you proposing?" David asked. "I've incorporated my own consulting firm, NovaLogic Consulting. I'll license my IP to Hypernova for 1 year at $750,000. During that time, I'll help your team, your new team, not Zara, properly document and transfer the knowledge. But here's the crucial part. I want the right to independently license my integration architecture to other companies." "That would mean our competitors." "No," I interrupted. "It means Argent Capital. They've already reached out to me directly. They're interested in my architecture for their entire portfolio. If Hypernova can't close the deal, I want the freedom to work with them independently." The silence was deafening. They knew what I was really saying. I held the keys to the $94 million investment, and I could take it with me if I walked. At 3:45 p.m., while the board was still deliberating, news broke on TechCrunch. Hypernova CEO Elliot Kane steps down amid platform crisis and investor concerns. The article was devastating, detailing the platform outage, the failed Argent Capital demo, and questions about intellectual property ownership. Within minutes, my LinkedIn exploded with messages. Recruiters, competitors, and 3 different VCs wanted to talk about my integration architecture. The story was spreading like wildfire through Silicon Valley. At 4:20 p.m., Argent Capital sent another email, this time addressed primarily to me with the board copied. "Ms. Morgan, we've been following the situation at Hypernova with concern. We remain highly interested in the integration architecture you've developed. Whether that investment flows through Hypernova or through a direct relationship with your consulting firm is a discussion we're open to having. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." They were bypassing Hypernova entirely, ready to make a deal directly with me. The board saw the email at the same time I did. The power dynamic had completely shifted. David called me directly at 4:35 p.m. "Rachel, we accept your terms, all of them. $750,000 for the 1-year license. Plus you retain rights to independently license your architecture. We'll have the contracts drawn up immediately." "And Elliot's team Zara?" "Being escorted out as we speak. We're bringing Brad up as interim CTO. He speaks highly of you." I smiled. Brad was a good engineer and an even better person. He'd know how to rebuild properly. "Send me the contracts," I said. "Once they're signed, I'll provide the authorization codes. Your platform will be fully operational within an hour." By 5 p.m., Hypernova's platform was running perfectly. The status page went green. Customers stopped complaining. The bleeding stopped. But I wasn't done. Not quite yet. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in watching a man's carefully constructed image disintegrate. Elliot Kane, the Golden Boy CEO who'd walked into Hypernova 6 months ago promising transformation, was now Silicon Valley's newest cautionary tale. Saturday morning, more details emerged. An anonymous source, definitely not Brad, he would never do such a thing, leaked internal Slack messages to TechCrunch. The screenshots showed Elliot dismissing engineering concerns, calling the compliance warnings bureaucratic nonsense, and my favorite, a message sent at 3:12 a.m. during the crisis. "Just override everything. I don't care about some random engineer's permissions." That random engineer had just secured $750,000 and kept her IP rights. By Sunday, Elliot's LinkedIn had gone dark. The confident headshot and CEO title were gone, replaced with seeking new opportunities. The endorsements for leadership and strategic vision looked particularly ironic now. Someone had even started a Twitter thread documenting his rise and fall, complete with screenshots of his pre-crisis boasts about revolutionizing enterprise integration. But the real devastation came Monday morning. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece, How a Fired Engineer's Hidden Clause Toppled a $94 deal. They'd done their homework, interviewing former employees, analyzing the timeline, even getting a quote from an IP lawyer who called my compliance framework clause brilliantly prophetic. The article revealed something I hadn't known. Elliott had personally stood to gain a $2 million bonus if the Argent Capital deal closed. He'd fired 40% of the engineering team to make the numbers look better for investors, planning to hire cheaper contractors after the funding came through. My termination had saved the company $90,000 in salary, which he'd proudly mentioned to the board as efficiency optimization. $90,000 saved, $750,000 lost. The math was poetic. Tuesday brought another revelation. Zara Mitchell, the 26-year-old head of platform development, had lasted exactly 6 days in the role. Her LinkedIn now read Product Management Consultant, and she'd deleted all mentions of Hypernova. Her father, Elliott's former colleague who'd recommended her, sent a scathing email to the board apologizing for the connection. Even nepotism has its limits, apparently. But the real schadenfreude came Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Palo Alto, meeting with a representative from Argent Capital, when my phone buzzed. It was a Google alert for Elliott's name. He'd been hired by a small startup in Austin as a strategic advisor, not CEO. The startup made scheduling software for dentists, from $94 million enterprise deals to helping dentists book appointments. The mighty had truly fallen. The Argent representative, a sharp woman named Catherine, noticed my smile. "Seeing the news about your former CEO?" she asked. "Former CEO who fired me over Zoom while stealing my work," I corrected. "And yes," she laughed. "We did our due diligence on him after everything came out. Turns out this wasn't his first time, at his last company. He pushed out the technical founder right before an acquisition, claiming the technology as a team effort. The deal fell through when the founder sued. And Hypernova's board didn't know this. They didn't dig deep enough. They saw the MBA from Wharton, the polished presentations, the executive presence. They didn't look for the pattern. We returned to our discussion. Argent Capital wanted to license my architecture for 3 of their portfolio companies. The number they offered made my Hypernova deal look like pocket change, but more importantly, they wanted me to retain ownership and continue developing it. "We believe in investing in people, not just products," Catherine said. Elliott never understood that. He thought he could take the people out of the equation. That code was just code. You proved him wrong. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed again. It was a LinkedIn notification. Elliott had viewed my profile. No message, no connection request, just a view. I wondered what he thought. Seeing my new title, founder and CEO, NovaLogic Consulting, clients Argent Capital, Hypernova Systems, and others. Later that evening, I got a text from Brad. "The team wanted me to thank you, not just for saving the platform, but for showing everyone that engineers aren't replaceable cogs. Also, we've instituted a new company policy, no more Zoom firings." I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. There was code to write, architecture to refine, a business to build. Elliott was probably somewhere, maybe in his Austin apartment, preparing his strategic advice for dentists. Zara was likely updating her resume, removing any trace of her 6-day tenure. The board members who'd enabled Elliott's behavior were doing damage control. And me, I was exactly where I wanted to be, in control of my own work, my own worth, and my own future. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't about destroying someone. It was about refusing to let them destroy you. And sometimes, if you're very careful and very smart, you can make them destroy themselves instead. 1 week later, I stood in my new office, a modest but elegant space in downtown Mountain View. NovaLogic Consulting was no longer just a vengeful dream. It was a legitimate company with 3 employees and contracts worth more than I'd ever imagined. The walls were still bare except for one framed document, the original Section 7.3b compliance framework, signed and dated 2 years ago. My insurance policy that had paid out beyond my wildest expectations. The doorbell chimed. It was a courier with a certified letter from Hypernova's legal department. I signed for it, already knowing what it contained. Patricia Stern had mentioned it was coming a formal request for a 6-month extension on our licensing agreement, along with a purchase offer for permanent rights to my integration architecture. The number at the bottom of the page was $8 million. I set the letter aside and checked my email. There were 17 messages from various VCs and tech companies. Everyone wanted to know about the engineer who'd brought down a CEO with a single clause. But the email that caught my attention was from an address I didn't recognize. Ms. Morgan. You don't know me, but I was one of the engineers laid off with you during that Zoom call. Your story gave me the courage to review my own contracts and documentation. Turns out, the predictive analytics module I built had similar protections. Thanks to your example, I just negotiated a licensing deal with my former employer. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just personal victory, it's showing others they have power too. With admiration. Sarah Kim. I smiled. Sarah had been one of the quiet ones. Brilliant but never assertive. If my stand had helped her find her voice, then everything had been worth it twice over. My phone rang. It was Catherine from Argent Capital. Rachel, I'm calling with an update. We've completed our investment in Hypernova. $32 million, not 94. The reduced valuation reflects the leadership challenges they experienced. But here's the interesting part: we've set aside the remaining capital for a new fund focused on engineer-founded companies. We'd like you to be our technical advisor. You want me to help evaluate startups. We want you to help us identify founders who understand both code and contracts, engineers who know their worth. The Elliots of the world have had their run. It's time for the builders to take the wheel. After the call, I sat back in my chair and looked out at the Bay Area skyline. Somewhere out there, Elliot was probably crafting PowerPoints about dental appointments, wondering where it all went wrong. He'd probably blame me, the board, the market, everyone but himself. That's what people like him do. They fail upward until they can't anymore. Then they blame the ground for being too hard when they finally fall. But I'd learned something valuable through all of this. The tech world loves to talk about disruption, about breaking things and moving fast. But sometimes the most powerful disruption is simply refusing to be broken. Sometimes it's reading the fine print. Sometimes it's knowing that your value isn't determined by someone else's spreadsheet or org chart. I pulled up the Hypernova licensing agreement on my screen. $8 million for permanent rights. It was a fair offer, more than fair, actually. But I wasn't ready to sell, not yet. My architecture was evolving, improving. 3 more companies had reached out just this morning. The integration logic that Elliot had tried to steal was becoming an industry standard. I drafted my response to Patricia. Thank you for the offer. I'm willing to extend the license for 6 months at the current rate. Regarding permanent rights, I believe the technology needs more development before we discuss a final sale. I'm happy to revisit in Q3. Also, please tell Brad he's doing an excellent job as CTO. The platform stability metrics are the best they've been in years. Before sending it, I added one more line. P.S. I noticed you've updated your termination policies to require in-person meetings with full documentation. Good call. I hit send, then closed my laptop. It was 5:30 p.m. on a Friday. A month ago, I would have been in Hypernova's office, probably debugging someone else's code or writing documentation that no one would read. Now I was the CEO of my own company, the architect of my own future. My phone buzzed one last time, a LinkedIn notification. Elliot Kane had updated his bio. Strategic advisor, dental tech innovator, learning from every experience. Learning from every experience. I wondered if he'd learned that you can't build an empire on stolen foundations, that you can't code switch your way past actual code, that sometimes the person you step on to climb higher is the one holding the ladder. I locked my office and headed home. Tomorrow, I had a meeting with another Fortune 500 company interested in my architecture. Sunday, I was speaking at a Women in Tech conference about protecting your intellectual property. Monday, I'd start working on version 2.0 of the integration logic that had changed my life. Revenge was complete. But success, that was just beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever had a workplace betrayal that turned into triumph? I'd love to hear your experiences.